Not yet.
Not yet. Oh. Welcome everyone to the Virtual Open House. This session is exploring WSET's Level 1 and Level 2 award in spirits. My name is Sarah Andrew and I come from Melbourne, Australia. In the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, pay that respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be here today. You may know it as Melbourne, but it is actually the Kulin Nation. I am the Business Development Manager for Australia and New Zealand. I'm also ETP qualified as an educator, and I'm very excited to be joining this Spirits session as a fairly new Spirits educator. Please may I welcome also my co-host, Liam Scandrett, to introduce himself.
Greetings, everyone. Hi from dreary Birmingham, England this morning. It's a pleasure to be back again for Virtual Open House, and it's a pleasure to be talking to you today. I'm Senior Business Development Manager for Spirits, exclusively at the Europe, Middle East, Africa and India region, so located in a very different part of the world to Sarah, but focused exclusively on our spirits qualifications and working with our trade partners, providers and educators across that territory, and looking forward to talking you through our levels 1 and 2 in spirits today.
Fantastic, thank you, Liam. So just a little bit of housekeeping to cover off. You'll see at the top right hand side of your screen there is a chat function. Would love to know where you're from and what your connection is and the reason why you're here today. There is a Q&A tab, so please use the Q&A tab if you do have any pertinent questions rather than the chat function. We will try to get to as many of the questions as we can at the end of the session, but if we don't cover them all off, we will make contact with you to answer those questions. There is another session running concurrently to this one in French and Spanish, so if you would really prefer to change languages, please head to the live sessions option on the left-hand side of the bar and click join to join that session. Let's introduce you to WSET. We are the world's leading provider of qualifications in wine, spirits and sake. We're a global organisation with extended community of students, alumni, experts, educators and partners all over the world. We also are the awarding body that develops the specifications, study materials and exams for all WSET qualifications. WSET Spirits courses are offered in 10 languages through an extensive global network of course providers in over 200 locations worldwide across 44 markets. Each WSET course provider is approved and trained by us to deliver our qualifications to our high educational standards. Your course provider will handle your enrolment, they will organise your course delivery, and they will administrate your exam and answer any queries. They will be your point of contact throughout your learning experience. At the end of the session, we'll let you know how you can find your nearest course provider. Each provider sets their own course schedules and course fees, so there may be some questions that only they can answer. But today we will let you know about the kind of experience you can expect and when to book onto a WSET course wherever you are in the world. When starting your WSET education, it's possible to start at Level 1 Award in Spirits, but you could also go straight into Level 2. Neither require prior knowledge of the subject. So I guess you may ask the question, where do you begin? The answer depends on your current circumstances and your future goals. In this session, we will step you through the choices and the best route for you. If you've already taken Level 1, this session will help you understand what's involved in your next step to Level 2. So, what we will cover today. We will look at the WSET learning pathways. We will look at the overview of Level 1 Award in Spirits with a tasting demonstration at Level 1. We will also discuss theory. We'll look at the overview of WSET Level 2 Awards in Spirits, and we will have a tasting demonstration at Level 2. We will look at the key considerations and study options, and then the next steps in terms of finding a course. So in terms of our qualification suite, we offer a suite of 9 qualifications covering wines, spirits and sake. Our educational products offer impartial, brand neutral and skill-based learning on which individuals and businesses can build knowledge and expertise. All qualifications except for the WSET Level 3 award in Sake are available to study online as well as in person. I will now hand over to my colleague Liam to step you through the differences between Level 1 and Level 2 award in spirits.
Thanks, Sarah. And it's important to say here that this is going to be a brief comparison. Most of the points we're going to cover on this slide are going to be covered in more detail as we move through this presentation. Some of you will be aware in recent years the WSET has decoupled our wine and spirits qualifications, and that's enabled for dedicated resource in spirits and this dedicated subject matter stream in spirits that has enabled the development of our most advanced spirits qualification Level 3, which Sarah and I will be talking about in another session in a couple of hours. But we really have this progressive pathway of learning through Level 1 and Level 2. And here I'm going to compare and contrast the kind of fundamentals of each qualification in terms of what they cover, how much time is required. And we're largely going to focus on the time commitment and the breadth of knowledge in each level here. So as you can see, Level 1 is what we call a beginner level qualification. It's introductory, it covers the fundamentals. And whereas Level 2 also covers the fundamentals, because there is no prerequisite to studying Level 2, you can come onto it as a complete newbie. It goes to an intermediate level, so it goes into greater depth in all of those same spirit categories. And you can see that's reflected in the learning hours there. So a total of 6 hours for Level 1, which is all guided by an educator, typically covered in one day in the classroom or over 4 weeks via our online classroom, and we'll cover some of those study options later on in the presentation. Whereas Level 2 is a greater time commitment, a total of 26 hours, and 15 of those are guided learning hours in the classroom. That means the other 11 hours are private study, so the study time that students are expected to put in reading the textbook. Beyond that, there's a broader range of categories and subcategories of spirits covered at Level 2, where we're covering around 20 different categories or types at Level 1. It's up to 35 categories or types at Level 2, and that is reflected in the tasting samples as well. It's typically around 10 tasting samples at Level 1, can be a little bit more, but 30 recommended samples at Level 2, and again, it can be a little bit more. It depends on your course provider. And below that, we've got reference to what we call the command verbs, and that kind of gives an indication of what we're testing, what we're assessing at each of these levels. At Level 1, it's really about the knowing. So identifying certain things about spirits, stating, naming, locating, or even listing certain things in assessment. Very much about the what. Whereas at Level 2, we're looking for students to understand more. So they need to be able to describe certain production features, for example, and know how certain production features influence style and flavor in spirits, for example. And we'll talk more about some of that theory in the next slide. In terms of assessment, they're both multiple choice exams, but there's just 30 multiple choice questions at Level 1 and 50 at Level 2. I think we can move on, Sarah.
Fantastic, thank you. So just as a really quick recap, let me move the slide on. There we go. To recap on the theory. So WSET qualifications offer a progressive learning pathway with knowledge and skills developed further each level. You can learn for as little as 1 day or develop your skills over time, depending on the structure with your course provider. So as a recap, for Level 1, as Liam said, it is all about basic factual recall. It's the what questions. Liam, can you tell us what to expect for Level 2 as a summary?
Sure. And in a nutshell, I would say if Level 1 is about the what, what defines a spirit and what does it taste like? Level 2 is about understanding. So how does one spirit differ from another, and how do the production choices influence that difference in style and flavor? Because at Level 2, we're exploring a broader range of subcategories of spirits. So comparing one bourbon against another, for example, and exploring the production choices and how they impact on the differences that we find in the glass.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And then level 3. So this is the only award that we do have a prerequisite of level 2 before you move on to level 3. The qualification focuses on the development of more advanced skills. To achieve those skills, it's important to first build the foundation knowledge and understanding, which really sets you up for a successful completion of level 3 and the assessment. We will be going into more detail in terms of theory and tasting as we address that in a session at 9 o'clock this evening, if you'd like to join us then. So let's jump straight in, level 1. So what we'll be learning at level 1, we'll be learning about spirits production. So you'll be learning to list and state the purpose of the main production processes and stills commonly used in the production of spirits. You'll be looking at principal types and categories. You'll be naming the principal categories and types of spirits and aromatized wines and state their defining characteristics. And finally, we'll be looking at cocktails, knowing the principles used to create a balanced cocktail and name some of the core cocktail families. This is the fun bit of level 1 because we do get to practice this. Tasting spirits. Whilst we do taste level 1, level 2 and level 3, the assessment for level 1 and 2 is not tasting, it's theory only. So to know how to make a basic description of a spirits using WSET's systematic approach to tasting is learnt at level 1 and level 2, but not tested until you arrive at level 3. So Liam, oh, sorry, I've jumped a slide. Let me just go back one. Who might be students that come on board for level 1 award in spirits? What type of backgrounds might they come from?
Well, there's a lot of change happening in our industry at the moment, right? There's a lot of sectors that are crying out for new staff, that are crying out for new blood, so to speak. So there's a lot of new starters, there's a lot of career changes as well. And the industry can be quite overwhelming to new starters, but in as little as 6 hours, as we've seen at level 1, you can be feeling much more confident interacting and talking about spirits through this introductory qualification. I find personally a lot of certainly at the moment in the field that I work in, there's a uptick in level 1 spirits candidate numbers because we have so much flux within the industry and so much new starters, both in hospitality, wholesale, retail, and so on. So there's a lot of level 1 coming through at the moment, and it's a relatively low bar for entry, right? You know, it's an accessible qualification. It can be delivered in one day, and it's often included in the induction expectations or the initial training within companies. So can be great for new starters there. Also, any customer-facing staff further on in their career, I think I would expect this as a baseline in on or off trade outlets. As we will come on to talk about, customers are becoming more and more savvy, and they're likely to ask you questions about the spirits list, whether you're working in a licensed premises or an off licensed premise. And level 1's going to give that basic knowledge and that vocabulary to describe spirits with confidence. And that's what this is all about. It's about confidence in communication, I would say. When you know a little bit about something, you're far more able to communicate that and far more confident in doing so. And as I've touched upon, there's a lot more interest and a lot more understanding now amongst consumers of spirits. And we're seeing a lot of spirits enthusiasts come onto these qualifications. And it's a perfect starting point for an enthusiast who wants to explore the broad range of spirits that are out there and understand spirits production and some of those key categories. Essentially, they can broaden their horizons. They might be interested or, you know, already drinking a particular spirit category, but they want to explore more and see where they can go from there. And also gain more confidence when making purchases. I mean, this is a great picture. We've all been in this position, you know, standing in front of a perplexing array of different spirits and wondering what we should buy either for ourselves or as a gift. And obviously a qualification like this can give you more confidence when making those purchases. You're making more informed and better purchases. And ultimately, with enthusiasts, there's always that element of showing off, right? Everybody wants to show off to their friends. Everybody wants to have a certificate to put in their toilet or something and just tell everybody that they've done this thing. It's all about the experience. And I'd say that our qualifications and the courses are experiential, right? They're interactive. You're having that experience with the educator and with the samples and with your peers. And that can be really valuable and rewarding for all of these people.
Fantastic. I'm certainly seeing from the ANZ market that I've come across enthusiasts that might be really into gin and they want to find out more about how to make gin. And then when they go on a level 1 award in spirits, they suddenly discover tequila and then they're on a whole new journey. And that interest and that engagement just grows, which is just really, really exciting. Thank you. So you've decided to undertake a level 1 award in spirits. The study materials, typically accompanied by the WSET issued workbook, which you'll fill out through the course and you'll be able to take away with you as a reference and have really great spirits tasting notes. Those that choose to study the WSET online classroom, the e-learning platform, don't need a workbook as everything is embedded into the online platform. Just letting you know that if you are considering doing online at this point in time, it is only available in English. But we'll talk more about the study options later on. Now I'm going to hand over to Liam, who's going to step us through a theory exercise. Liam, over to you.
Yes, I'm just going to give an example of the level of detail that we'd go into a particular subject at level 1, and the subject we've chosen is malting barley. This is an introductory qualification, so this is fairly rudimentary explanation of this process, but it's going to give students an indication of how the processing of grain takes place in order of converting complex carbohydrates into simple fermentable sugars. And with barley, we do that through malting. And you can see in the left-hand image, this barley seed. And a barley seed is a baby plant. It contains everything that the plant needs to grow. And it contains a store of food in the form of starch. And starch is a complex carbohydrate. And as spirits producers, we need to convert that starch into something that we can turn into alcohol, and that's sugar. So earlier on in the course, the students would have been introduced to our 4 stages of spirits production. And the first of those 4 stages is the processing of raw material. The aim of processing a raw material is to create a sugary liquid. And that's what we're doing here in malting barley. And malting is a process which allows distillers to complete this conversion, as I say, from starch into sugar. And what we do, we trick the grain into thinking that it's springtime. So we get it wet. And you can see on those 3 left-hand images, it's starting to swell and starting to grow. And the grain grows, and you can see the shoot emanating from the grain there in the 3rd image. And as it's doing so, the grain is releasing enzymes. Enzymes are catalysts for processes internally inside the grain. They occur naturally there. And we want to release and activate these enzymes through this malting process. Once it gets to the 3rd image there, we need to stop that growth. If we didn't, the plant would go ahead and consume all that sugar. Remember, that's what we want. So the growth is stopped by applying heat, typically in the form of hot air. But certain whiskies can have a smoky aroma, and we'll come on to taste those later on in the course. And that smoky aroma is inputted here through the use of peat. Peat's a naturally occurring vegetal matter that can be used as a fuel, and it's used in certain producers in order to contribute this smoky characteristic. At the end of this malting process, the grain is full of starch, but importantly, full of enzymes. Okay, so the process doesn't end here. We haven't completed conversion yet. We need to move on to our next slide. But now we have all these enzymes activated. So we take that now malted barley and we crush it. What happens when we crush a grain? Well, we turn it into a flour, essentially. This is quite a coarse flour. And we mix it with water, and the mixing with water at a certain temperature is going to really enable those enzymes to do their job and complete this conversion process from starch into sugar. And this is a process known as mashing within whiskey distillery. This is going to then create that sugary liquid that we need, which can then be fermented, and we can move on into our second key stage of spirits production. Okay.
Moving on.
Moving on.
Oh, sorry. Moving on to tasting, Liam, are you happy to step us through the process of tasting? Thank you.
Tasting's really important at any WSET level. Essentially, tasting is the vehicle that we use in order to understand the theory. As Sarah said earlier, it's not assessed until we get to level 3, but the skills are developed throughout those other stages. And that's again why level 2 is a prerequisite to level 3, because without practicing this and learning the sensory skills in order to taste spirits effectively, you would not be successful at level 3. And as we saw before, level 1 is very much about the know. So what does the spirit taste like? And importantly, we're linking those characteristics that we find in the glass back to stages of production at all levels. And we're doing that in more complex and more detailed ways as we move up through the levels. At level 1, we're tasting benchmark category examples. Yeah, so your kind of typical styles from those main categories to demonstrate what a bourbon tastes like, or what a Scotch whisky tastes like, or what a vodka tastes like, for example. At level 2, as we touched upon earlier, it's an opportunity for some more inter-category comparison. So we're comparing one Scotch whisky against another, or one bourbon against another, or one vodka against another, in order to understand the influence of production choices made at raw material stage, at fermentation stage, at distillation stage, or post-distillation. And ultimately kind of deciding what makes that spirit unique. Yeah. Why does one spirit differ from another? And there's a lot to be learned from discussing the parallels between spirits, both across category and within category, but also the differences that make them different, the differences in production that make them different in the glass. And at level 3, we're going into far more detail, and students will be assessed in terms of their descriptions, but also their quality conclusions. And that's why it says here how good is this spirit. You could discuss the quality level here rather. And we're going to add much more detail at level 3, and we'll be doing another session in a while where we'll look at the complexities of the level 3 systematic approach to tasting, which I'll introduce at levels 1 and 2 shortly. But at level 3, we're really looking for full and complete descriptions, and we're assessing the global world of spirits. There's a whole wealth of spirits tasted at level 3, but more on that later.
Perfect. So let's move on to the systematic approach to tasting for level 1. Over to you, Liam.
And this is the SAT, as it's known. This is a tool that we use at all levels, the systematic approach to tasting. It's a publicly available document at levels 2 and 3. So feel free to go onto the WSET Global website and check it out and use it for your own needs. This is the level 1 version, and it's basic. It's just really here encouraging the students' love for learning about spirits, actually starting to think about spirits in a professional and analytical manner, rather than simply as a recreational beverage, right? So this SAT is going to help us make clear, structured, and consistent tasting notes that anyone can understand. And the WSET work hard on developing this and the associated language for describing spirits so that it is universal and it is applicable in a whole variety of different sectors, job roles, markets around the world. So to demonstrate this at level 1, I'm just going to do a quick tasting of a bourbon. I've pre-poured a bourbon. It's Buffalo Trace. And in the classroom, as I say, we're just encouraging students to start thinking about this spirit in a bit more of a professional manner, start using their senses, which they use every day, but to really focus in on what's going on in the glass. And I can tell you the appearance here is amber. That's fairly typical for a bourbon of this type. And remember, we're looking at benchmark examples of the major categories at this level. And this would be a perfect example of that. So we have an amber color, and the nose is medium in intensity. Now, intensity might be a word that's unusual to some of you in this context. Essentially, what we mean by intensity is the kind of the volume of the aroma. And I use a lot of musical analogies when running through tastings. And intensity is how loud is it? How easy is it to smell? Yeah. Is it turned down to 1? and therefore neutral? Is it 2, 3, 4 on the dial and therefore light? Is it 5, 6, 7 on the dial and therefore medium? Or is it 8, 9, and 10 on the dial and therefore pronounced? This is medium in intensity. I can smell the aromas quite clearly, the definitive aromas of this category, when the spirit is around my mouth, and that's a fairly helpful indication of its intensity. And the aroma characteristics are of the raw material predominantly: corn, some sweet corn, some cornbread. Is there anything else that you can smell on here beyond the characteristics of the raw material, Sarah?
I'm getting a little bit of a fruit characteristic.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be coming from processing, and I find it helpful to think about these aromas in sequence. So where have they appeared on those 4 stages of production? So asking myself, firstly, what can I smell from raw material? And then asking myself, what can I smell from processing? And that could be the processing of the raw material into a sugary liquid. It could be fermentation, as it is here with these fruity aromas. And it's coming to us on this as a kind of like red apple, I would say, more than anything else. Potentially some banana. But though definitely a fruity characteristic, at level 1, we want to link to a particular flavor created during fermentation, created by the yeast during fermentation. The other major driver of aroma here is coming from oak, and it's largely vanilla as well as potentially some coconut, but largely vanilla here, and that's driven by oak.
That's quite prominent.
Yes, certainly, and that would be quintessential for a whiskey of this type, right? Driven by bold characteristics from the raw material, as well as the aromas of new oak that is fresh and hasn't been used for a spirit previously. It's charred on the inside. It introduces a great deal of bold oak characteristics early on, and it's coming to us here in the form of vanilla. Now, in a classroom setting, we're always going to be adding some water, reducing the ABV down to around 30 to 20%. And that's quite typical across the world of sensory analysis, to reduce the ABV down to help soften the alcohol so we can be more accurate in terms of some of these other characteristics. And then we move on into palate. And obviously that's when we're taking the spirit into our mouth and allowing our taste receptors there and our sense of touch, importantly, to play a role in this experience. So firstly, I'd encourage students to have a taste and think about the sweetness and the texture before we start to talk about flavor characteristics. Using a spittoon in the classroom is very, very important. It's certainly very important for me today at 9:28 in the morning. But the sense of touch there, a sense of a kind of note of the texture is intertwined with the sweet with the sugar level and the sweetness here. And this is a dry spirit. There is no sugar added, and that's evident on the palate. And it gives us a kind of warming sensation. It gives us a kind of quite a mouth-filling, quite a full-bodied sensation on the palate. And that's quite typical of whiskies like this, due to those bold production choices that we've discussed at the 4 stages. We've got flavors much like we encountered on the nose. So we've got those flavors of corn running through it, that backbone of sweet corn, popcorn, cornbread, as well as some of that fruitiness. The fruitiness isn't as prominent on the palate as it was on the nose, but certainly a kind of appley characteristic there, as well as bold vanilla and those kind of baking spices from oak. And the palate, the finish rather, is medium with some complexity. So it's not the longest thing in the world. There are a handful of characteristics that go on into the finish, but they do begin to narrow and become overwhelmed by oak.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liam. That's a really clear understanding of the systematic approach to tasting from appearance, nose, palate through to the finish.
Right.
So we've finished our level 1 award in spirits course, and we're arriving at our assessment. Let's cover off what you need to do on the day of your assessment. So we have 30 multiple choice questions. You have 45 minutes to complete your assessment. The pass rate is at 70%, so you need to correctly answer 23 out of the 30 questions. If you choose to do the exam online, English at this point in time is the only option, but there are multiple languages if you deliver it in person. And just to reiterate, there's no tasting exam for level 1. So if you're really thinking about joining up, you're keen to find out your nearest course provider, let's just do a little bit of a test of knowledge. So we've organised a poll for you to answer one by one each of the questions. So I'll read out question number 1. Which process is commonly used in whisky production in order to create a sugary liquid? There's only one right answer. Your options are A, fermentation, B, malting, C, distillation, and D, dilution. So for those of you that would like to take part in the poll, if you could make your selection and press submit, we will finish that up and move on to the next question. So A, B, C, or D. Say that again.
This will be a test of my teaching earlier.
It will be. It'll be a test of those that have joined us, whether they were listening or not. Okay, so that poll has obviously been closed. Let's move on to question number 2, mindful of time. Question number 2, which whiskey must be filtered through maple charcoal filter? A, you have a choice of rye whiskey. B is Japanese whiskey. C is Canadian whiskey. Or D is Tennessee whiskey. Only one answer is correct in terms of options A, B, C, and D. So make your selection and move on. And then third poll is question number 3. Which of the following can be used to balance sweetness in a cocktail? We have the options of sour, strong, weak, or bitter. And this time you've got the answers are either 1 and 4, 1 and 2, 2 and 3, or 3 and 4. So make your selection and then we can reveal the answers. Make your selection, select submit, and then we'll gather the poll results and see how we all get on in terms of you paying attention and Liam being your educator. Okay, so the poll has ended and I can see for question number 1, process commonly used in whisky production in order to create a sugary liquid. We have 62.5% have answered malting. Congratulations. Question number 2, which whiskey must be filtered through maple charcoal filter? We have the majority at 60% suggesting Tennessee whiskey. So again, well done. And finally, which of the following can be used to balance sweetness in a cocktail? And we have 100%, 1 and 4, sour and bitter. Excellent. Yeah. Hopefully we will have a lot of new candidates signing up for level 1 award in spirits in the coming weeks. Okay, so you've completed level 1, you've successfully passed. You're a little bit curious about level 2. Let's see what that's all about, shall we? So what will you learn at level 2? Again, you'll be looking at production factors, understanding the main production factors that affect a spirit's style. Principal spirit styles, understanding how the principal types of spirits are produced and labelled, and describing their key characteristic. And as Liam mentioned, when we step up to level 2, there are a lot more samples that we explore to consolidate the theoretical knowledge. We'll be looking at flavoured spirits and aromatised wines to understand flavoured spirits and aromatised wines, how they're produced and how they're labelled, and to understand the key characteristics in terms of descriptions. And then cocktails, to know the principles used to create a balanced cocktail and name some of the core cocktail families. Tasting spirits, again, you'll develop your palate, you'll develop your understanding of the systematic approach to tasting. However, you will not be assessed from a tasting perspective in the assessment, and we'll cover off the assessment at the end of this session. So Liam, level 2, what type of candidates do you see that might be slightly different to level 1, and what might be similar?
There are some similarities, sure. And I think any customer-facing role, or any individual in a customer-facing role should be aspiring to level 2 as a minimum, because this really gives some more authority and some more breadth and depth of understanding those various categories through more tasting and more exploring different production styles and choices. These are some examples of the people we see coming through level 2 courses. A lot of producers or people that work for brands and importers, as well as entrepreneurs and brand ambassadors and people who are representing those brands and going out into the world talking to people about them, because it adds to that kind of global context of spirits that those individuals work with on a daily basis and helps them understand the wider market. So, I had this conversation with our colleague Bonnie yesterday in our WSET for Business session. Brand people typically know a great deal about the brands they represent. They might be able to teach a WSET educator a thing or two about those brands, but often what's missing is that kind of wider context of the category and where their own brand sits versus their competitors and what makes their brand special and different. So a multi-category spirits qualification like this can really help give them that contextual understanding of the wider category. And that goes for producers as well. You touched upon it earlier, where with enthusiasts and often we've all seen this, a producer is making a gin, but actually in the long term they have aspirations to make other spirit categories and they want to broaden their horizons and offer more. So coming to do this qualification can help lay the foundations for that expansion and enable them to understand spirit categories that are outside of their current field. So we see quite a lot of that. And as I said, in the middle there, we've got anyone recommending spirits to customers. If you're in on or off trade and you're wanting to make honest, informed recommendations to your customers, then this is the qualification that's going to allow you to do that. Finally, a group close to my heart, cocktail bartenders, understanding your products, understanding the liquids is going to be a key step in making you a better bartender and making you more adept at mixing drinks, no doubt about that, and creating innovative serves. I mean, everybody's looking to do the new thing these days, but classics remain. And obviously you will always be using or leaning into those classic styles and recipes to twist and create new innovative serves. And by understanding the ingredients and what you can sub in and out for other things can be a real helpful string to your bow if you're looking to kind of develop menus and influence the drinks list in your venue or enter cocktail competitions. And often cocktail competitions expect those individuals, or rather the judges expect those individuals, to know the products intimately and tell them a story about those products and tell them how they were made and why they taste the way they do, and then why therefore they're using them in that particular cocktail.
Fantastic. And I think in that focus and that environment, like the cocktail bartenders, when you have a customer that comes up to the bar and just says, Liam, just make me a cocktail. If you've got that greater depth of knowledge and understanding, you can ask a few pertinent questions to have an educated guess that you might be making something that they're absolutely going to enjoy.
Yeah, people remember those experiences, right? People go to bars not for the drinks or the atmosphere. They actually go for the people that are there, often the people that are serving them, and that interaction that they have with them. And if you can give your customer an experience they haven't had before and stick in their memory for that experience, they're going to come back time and time again to see you and to get that kind of interaction and get that experience again.
Absolutely. So you've decided that you're going to delve into level 2 award in spirits. Let's have a quick look at the study material. So essentially you will be given a textbook, a workbook that you can use for the duration of the course. You'll be given a card that steps you through the systematic approach to tasting. Let's move on to a little example again. Level 2 award in spirits, the type of theory that we might see for level 2. Liam, over to you.
Yeah, so we're now going to cover the same process, but at the level 2 detail. And it's called Whiskey Basics at level 2. And if you remember this malting process, we very much summarized into 3 images on the side of the slide at level 1. Here we're breaking it down into its various steps. And we've got a cutaway image here of that barley grain that we saw previously at level 1. And as I said then, the plant has this store of starch inside the grain, and that starch is a complex carbohydrate that as spirits producers we can't use. So we need to convert that starch into a fermentable sugar. Fermentable sugars come in a variety of different forms. Complex carbohydrates come in a variety of different forms, and starch is actually a long chain of individual sugar molecules that are quite unwieldy. The plant stores them in these balls, right? And we can see that the kind of white in the image is that store of starch, and within that we've got these starch granules, as it says on the screen there, and they're indicated by these blue circles. And the first thing we need to do is unpack those starch granules. Essentially, that means breaking down this net or this matrix that is made of protein around them. And we do that through malting, and we discussed malting at level 1. Remind me what we need to do in malting, Sarah?
In malting,
Yeah.
that's the process of the grain is growing and developing. We stop that growth.
Yeah, so we need to get it wet. We need to trick that grain into thinking that it's springtime, right? So we steep it in some water and then we dry it out. We steep it in some water and we dry it out. And that's going to release those enzymes, and it's going to enable these starch granules to be unpacked. We've released our enzymes by this point. But then we need to unroll those starch granules, and we need to unravel them, and we do that through heat and water. And this is that you can bring up the next animation, the milling and the mashing process that we saw previously, and that's going to unroll the starch and dissolve it in water, giving us a starchy liquid. So we don't have a sugary liquid yet. Remember, that's our aim. We just have a starchy liquid. And here we need to incorporate enzymes again. Enzymes are present in certain grains. If they've been malted, now we can activate and use those to convert starch into sugar. It's the enzymes that do that job for us, and that's going to give us glucose, which is the simple sugar we get from grains, which is fermentable. If we move on to the next slide, we can see how we do that with a particular grain in barley. And we saw this slide before. We've got this steeping of the grain in water, and it's swelling and it's growing, and those warm and damp conditions are allowing the release of those enzymes. Once those enzymes are released, we need to stop that process, and we do that through the addition of hot air, and we can use peat here, as we saw previously. And after malting, the starch granules have been unpacked from that protein net, the enzymes have been released, and then we can complete the next stage, right? And remember, here we don't have any sugars yet. We just have available starch and released enzymes. In order to complete that conversion process, as we saw on a couple of slides ago, we need to introduce heat and water. So first, we take that, if you want to move on to the next slide, please, Sarah. We take that malted barley, which has that unpacked starch and those released enzymes. And remember, we crush it into a flour. And then we mix with warm water in something called mashing. And that's going to allow those starch granules to be unrolled and dissolved. And the enzymes that are present in malted barley are going to convert the unraveled available starches into sugar. From there, we can add yeast and can continue on with our next stage of alcoholic fermentation. However, it's quite common in whiskey production to incorporate other grains, and actually we can start to make those starches available through, as you saw on the previous slide, through cooking in high pressure ovens. That's quite common in American whiskey. So we can take some of these unmalted grains and incorporate them into the same mash. So again, crushing them into a flour, cooking them in hot water, but that cooking in hot water is not going to give us sugar. We're just going to be getting a starchy liquid there, but then we're mixing that with the malted barley potentially that we've just seen. And that actually is going to provide us with enzymes. However, we could incorporate some exogenous enzymes depending on the country of production, depending if they're permitted. Exogenous enzymes are going to allow us to complete that starch to sugar conversion, giving us a sugary liquid, which we can then move on into fermentation through the addition of yeast.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liam. So switching gears, we're moving from theory to tasting, but we're not disassociating the theory, because the purpose of tasting is not just for palate calibration and understanding and descriptors, but it is actually to reinforce the theory. Why do we see what we see? Why do we taste what we taste? Why do we smell what we smell? So Liam, are you happy to start describing this diagram we have in front of us?
Yeah, sure. As we touched upon earlier, tasting is absolutely key at every level, but at level 2 is really where we're starting to make those links between production choices, so the knowledge we have about production, and our tasting note. So this wiggly line that you see on the screen is some of the elements of our tasting note, right? We've got aromas of corn and rye bread. Those aromas are pronounced and the spirit is dry on the palate. So we've made all those observations about the spirit in our tasting note. But it's important at level 2 that we link those particular features to a choice made by production. So the aromas of corn and rye bread in the bourbon that we tasted earlier are linked to the raw material. They are derivative of the raw material, and the raw material for the bourbon we tasted earlier was corn and rye. Those were the two most dominant grains. In order to be labeled a bourbon, it needs to be majority corn, and typically the secondary grain in those mashes is rye, and that's why we have aromas of corn and rye bread in our whiskey. The reason those aromas are pronounced, remember we had this pronounced description of intensity. The reason they are pronounced on this spirit is because the distillation strength is low. What's really important, and something that we are emphasizing throughout both levels 1 and 2, is this relationship between distillation strength and flavor intensity or aroma intensity. The lower the distillation strength, the more intensity of those aromas from pre-distillation. So the reason we have so much corn and rye bread on this whiskey is because it's been distilled to a low strength and therefore retaining a lot of those flavors from pre-distillation. Equally, the spirit is dry on the palate. Fairly obviously, it's dry on the palate because no sugar has been added. And that's an important feature to note, and a really definitive feature about this category of spirit. The next animation will link these two, and that's often where the understanding for students is taking place. As I've said throughout, the tasting is a vehicle that we use to understand the theory. So we're using those samples to reinforce those theoretical choices that have been made, those production choices that have been made, and the theory about each spirit. And this understanding will happen naturally inside the students' heads during the course. And not only that, it's a skill that they can apply outside of the realms of the classroom. So the learning doesn't just stop when the course finishes. They can take this skill that they've honed through a level 2 course and apply it to other spirits that they're tasting, and make those links throughout their professional career.
Fantastic. Shall we put this into practice and taste, Liam?
Yes, please. Let's do that. Okay. So I'm going to taste a different whiskey this time, mainly to kind of talk you through not only the differences in the level 2 SAT, but also some of that intercategory comparison that's so important at level 2. And as I've alluded to, the SAT gets more and more complex as we move up through the levels. So there are more lines, there are more descriptions expected of the students. And one thing we make quite clear at level 2 is that, you know, appearance is probably the least important part of the process when it comes to tasting spirits. Our eyes can be deceived, color can be added and color can be taken away. So we don't dwell a long time on appearance, but I can tell you that this whiskey is clear, it has a medium intensity, and it is amber again. Now, we have a line for condition here. This and all spirits you're likely to taste on a level 2 will be clean, they're as intended. And the intensity here is also medium. Again, I can smell those aromas quite clearly from when the spirit is near my mouth. And those aromas are different this time. And we would compare the aromas in this whiskey compared to the aromas in the bourbon whiskey that we tasted earlier, and really have students try and understand and identify themselves the differences in the grain character. Both of these whiskies have been made from grain, but different grains have been included, right? So as we said previously, the bourbon is predominantly corn with that secondary grain of rye, and that's where we've got these cornbread and rye bread aromas on it. Here we have, it's a blended Scotch whiskey. It's Johnnie Walker Black. So we've got this backbone of grain whiskey that was made from either wheat or corn, but then these single malt whiskies blended together with that. And those single malt whiskies providing a lot of this grain character here, which is coming to us as kind of cereal malts. Sometimes you might describe it as like a biscuity, digestive kind of characteristic. We've got some fruit here as well. It might be a more kind of a dried fruit characteristic, as well as citrus peel, particularly orange, I would say. And there's a honeyed characteristic to this as well. And that honeyed characteristic contributes slightly from the oak, but really, it's a development of those cereal flavors as well. Think about some of those kind of honeyed cereals that you might have at breakfast. The citrus peel, you might say, is coming from a little bit of the fermentation character there. There's probably some other kind of other fruity characteristics coming along with that as well. And there's a little touch of smoke here. Now, where would that smoke be coming from, Sarah?
Well, I'm thinking that smoke could be coming from the barrel, but it could also be come from that malting process that you referred to.
Yeah, exactly. So it's coming from peat used
Peat.
in the malt, one of the single malts here. Okay, so this is a blend of a couple of different grain whiskies and a whole array of different single malts. And I can tell you a couple of them are peated and they have that smoky characteristic, and it's contributing just a wisp of smoke to this as well. There's also something in here akin to leather, which is giving me indication of some longer age as well. Something we talk about in some depth at level 2 is something called rancio, and that's these developed oxidized characteristics. And there are some spirits in here of significant age. This has a 12 on the label, and what does that indicate to me, Sarah?
That's the years of maturation, and it's the youngest spirit that is in the blend.
So as per the Scotch whisky regulations, the youngest spirit in the blend goes on the label, and this has a 12, but there will be some spirits in here of greater age, and that's contributing to this kind of extra level of aroma, this kind of leather, really kind of developed characteristic. If we add some water and then move on to the palate, we can discuss that. Then we'll move on to the next slide in order to talk through that.
There we go.
And again, think about the sweetness and texture in combination. Again, this is very clearly a dry spirit, okay? There is no evidence of sugar on the palate, and we know from what we've discussed in the Scotch whisky regulations that this is not permitted. So we know this is a dry spirit. Comes along with a warming texture with a little note of sharpness, but it's quite balanced and it's got a rounded mouthfeel to it. It's very present on the palate. There's a medium flavor intensity. And again, we can think about that volume analogy. It's not the loudest spirit in the world, but it's definitely up there into medium, probably at the high end of medium. And what you'll be encouraged as a level 2 student, you'll need to pick one of these descriptors. When there's a hyphen in between these words, you must pick one. When it says EG, that's an example. So you can pick a number of different descriptors at that line. And for example, on texture, we've got, for example, rough, smooth, watery, mouth-filling, and warming. I always encourage students to not be limited by these descriptions. There are other words that you could use as well, and feel free to do that. But when there's a hyphen between the words, picking one is necessary. Flavor characteristics, we've got those flavors of cereal, malt, biscuity character. some dried fruit, some citrus peel, that kind of honeyed character, and definitely that smoke and leather coming through towards the finish as well. It's got this kind of peppery smoke finish to it. Again, there's a medium length finish, doesn't last a lifetime, but it's, you know, probably at the top end of medium with some complexity. Now, one thing that we didn't do at level 1, which is important that we do at level 2, is assess quality. And we assess quality on a number of different assessment criteria that are covered and defined early on in the course. They're largely around balance, as well as intensity, complexity, and length, but also expressiveness. And expressiveness is, does the spirit do as intended? Is it a true reflection of its category and its production choices, and does it articulate those production choices effectively? I would say in this case it's a very good expression of this category. The only area where it is not quite where it might be intended is that on that complexity level. It falls away slightly on the finish, making it medium and some complexity. And a spirit of this type would probably be aiming for something of greater length and greater complexity. So that's why we've judged it as a very good spirit.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liam. So we've arrived at the end of the course. You're wanting to know how you're going to be assessed for level 2 award in spirits. So the exam, we're stepping up to 50 multiple choice. You have an hour to complete. A pass rate is 55%, so you need 28 out of 50 questions. If you're achieving a merit, it's 70% or 35 out of 50. A distinction is 85% and above, so 43 out of 50. And just as a reminder, online examination at this point in time is English only or in person. And it is worth checking with your course provider before you sign up if you have a preference for one or the other, because not all APP offer both. So are you ready? And I know there's been a question already from one of our guests asking about whether they'd be okay to jump straight into level 2, and we'll address that at the end specifically. But we have 3 questions to test your knowledge. So question number 1, what process does a raw material containing starch need to undergo first? Is it needing conversion, oak maturation, distillation, or filtration? So if you can choose one of those answers from the poll and submit, we will then move on to the next question. So question number 2, pronounced aromas of sweet corn, vanilla, and coconut are typically, or a combination typically found in a single malt whiskey, a tequila reposado, a straight bourbon, or a rum agricole. Again, one answer, please, using the poll when it's presented. We're just closing off that first poll. But for question number 2, single malt whiskey, tequila reposado, straight bourbon, or a rum agricole. If you've got the answer in your mind as we're waiting for that second poll to come up, the third question, which one of the following is an example of a short sour? A mojito, a daiquiri, a Manhattan, or a horse's neck? So that will be the third poll. I think we might be waiting for a few more people to close off that first poll. It is unanimous. Oh, not unanimous. It is, no, we don't know who you are. So feel free to jump in. Excellent. Nice. I think we've got the results. Liam, would you like to, oh no, we're still on to the second one. I think everyone's still revered in your tasting of the Johnnie Walker Black.
I can see some results.
Okay, would you like to start reading them out then?
Yeah, so we've got 100% pass rate on the first question, which was about processing raw material containing starch. It needs to undergo conversion. So well done, everyone there. Pronounced aromas of sweet corn, vanilla, and coconut are a combination typically found in straight bourbon. Well done to everybody there as well. And which one of the following is an example of a short sour? And 100% of the answers have got that one right as well. That's daiquiri.
Oh, fantastic. That's great results. So I would say whoever's been responding is in the zone to ready to jump straight into level 2.
Yeah.
So choosing your study method. Certainly we've broadened our offering since the pandemic. We simply had to. Traditionally in person, it was the way most students studied. with a group of other students, the educator teaching the class live. It can be split over days, evenings, weekends, and tasting samples are typically included in the offering with your course fee. Liam, would you like to step through the virtual?
Sure. So yeah, virtual courses is something that came in during the pandemic as well. Obviously, we couldn't all gather in the same room at the same time, but we and educators globally wanted to continue the education. In fact, it was required. So many turned to platforms like this, but others are available, like some Zoom and Microsoft Teams and so on, to deliver the WSET education and replicate the classroom experience as closely as possible. And obviously, some of those programs and that software feature, whiteboards, group discussions, and all these kind of elements to replicate that classroom experience. And many APPs, course providers, should I say, and educators did that with great success. So it's something we formalized, and it's important to recognize as well, I think I'll say here, is some of our course providers are using these study methods in combination with one another. So it's not simply a case of just utilizing one. You might be able to have a blended learning experience which incorporates both WSET's online classroom with some virtual course elements where you have some face time with that educator.
Fantastic, thank you. And that moves nicely on to the third option, which is WSET's online classroom. Currently, as I mentioned, only available English. There is a dedicated educator that is online that will guide you through your studies, will mark exercises that you do and read your tasting notes. The great flexibility of this is that there are no set hours, and you can see, if you're a night owl and like to study between 1 and 3 a.m, log on and away you go. Tasting samples are sometimes provided by the course provider, but you would need to check with your course provider about this. But for the online exam at this point in time is only in English. And for someone that had only ever studied as a student in person, I had to complete level 3 online as a bit of a hybrid, and I absolutely loved the Canvas online e-platform that we use. I found it really user-friendly, great support, and a really great experience. It's probably worth mentioning at this point in time, as we move on to one of the last slides for the session, where should you begin? Because I know there has been a question in the Q&A chat, so this probably will help answer that for you without telling you what is best for you, not knowing you. Think about your prior knowledge. Think about your confidence in spirits. Think about the current needs and why you're wanting to study. Put that in context with your goals and ambitions. And certainly, most importantly, Liam, I'd love you to talk about time and budget, because they're probably the most two important considerations.
Sure, and as we discussed earlier, level 1 is an accessible qualification. It's available at a relatively low cost, and obviously requires far less commitment in terms of time. So if those are two pressures, then level 1 is an easy starting point for you. It all depends, as the other points demonstrate, what those kind of long-term ambitions are, and only you can make that decision. But yeah, go onto the Where to Study page, check out some of our course providers, and see what the offering is and what suits your needs.
Fantastic. And in addition, in the chat, Charlotte's dropped in links to the specification guides. And again, in answer to the question that was in the Q&A chat, that's a great way to have a look at the content and the level, to have an understanding of whether you've already arrived there and should be looking at the next level up, or whether that's going to be a journey that you're going to learn a lot. So this brings us to finding your course. As mentioned at the beginning of this session, we have over 200 locations, over 40 countries and 10 languages. The QR code will assist you to bring up nearest course providers to you. Or you can visit wsetglobal.com/where-to-study, and there'll be a map and a drop down that you can look at your own geographical location. So that does bring us to the end of the presentation. There's a little poll that we would love for improvement and feedback, whether this has been beneficial. If you could just complete that last poll, how are you feeling about taking a WSET course? You're ready to sign up. This has helped a lot, but you're still thinking, or you're looking for something else. That would be just great for us to have a greater understanding. I'd certainly like to thank all of you for joining this morning, this evening, and this afternoon, wherever you are in the world. If you're curious to know about WSET Level 3 in Spirits, Liam and I will be back online hosting in about an hour. But until then, thank you all for joining us. Go well, stay safe. And Liam, thank you for your company. It's been great catching up.
It's been fun, Sarah. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.